Well, today we're in the last week of a sermon series titled Reconstructing American Christianity, and I'm excited to be almost done with this series, personally. And, I thought I'd go out on an easy note, so if you've checked the title of today's message, it's going to be lighthearted. But I'm glad for the opportunity to preach on this topic. I think it's necessary, and it was a struggle to preach on because there was so much to say. And quite honestly, there were so many things that I thought needed to be addressed that I didn't in this series. And I confess to all of you in the beginning, and this is the general way it goes. When I start a sermon series, I'm doing the study as I'm preparing the messages, and I'm not quite sure where it's going to go. In fact, it's an exercise in trying to trust in the Spirit and see where God might lead it. And so if it all kind of works together, at the end, and it's all tied together, don't ever think, oh, wow, Scott really had that planned out, because I didn't. That's the work of the Spirit. So I hope that today ties a lot of it together. It's an important topic, and as Violet mentioned, we're going to start to have some groups on Thursday night, starting next week and throughout the month of June. I think of these almost as if they're like AA groups, like, my name is Scott, and I'm a deconstructing, reconstructing Christian, Yeah. Because I think we need to talk about it. We need to talk about it, and our goal as a church is to be a place where you can talk about things and be open. So I first got interested in the topic of deconstructing, reconstructing, when I began to see statistics like this. In 1972, 90% of Americans identified as being Christians. Over the next 30 years, it declined down to 64%. And according to Pew Research, if the trend continues, it will be down to 35% in 2070. And this is one of several studies that have shown that people are leaving the church and leaving Christianity for a variety of reasons. And as I began to look into this research and other research and read books and hear the stories of people here at our church and just talk to people in general, I began to realize and form an opinion, and that opinion is this, that a version of Christianity has developed in America that stands in the way of the gospel of Jesus. And as depressing as that is, I think that there's good news and there's hope in this, because as I've talked to people and as I've done research, what I have found, and I'm sure there's some exceptions, but in general, across the board, what I hear and what I read is that people are not deconstructing Jesus. Nobody's leaving the faith going, when Jesus said, love your enemies, or when he said, give to those, or when he washed the disciples' feet, that was it for me. I had to leave it. It's never in reaction to a teaching of Jesus or something that Jesus did that people are saying that caused them to leave the faith. Rather, what I have found is that they are deconstructing a version of Christianity that claims to be about Jesus, but really isn't. And I know that that's quite a claim to make, but that's what I think after looking at this. That Jesus is talked about, but when you get beneath the surface, his teachings, his viewpoint, his actions are not the focus. In his article, Why People Are Leaving Christianity, Brandon Flannery, he notes that there's this rise of these hashtags, ex-Christian and ex-evangelical. And to be clear, people are leaving versions of Christianity outside of the evangelical church, the mainline Protestant church, which our church is in that tradition, has seen decline. But there is this growth of people that grew up in evangelical settings that has seen this big exodus of folk. And we know that because of research like Brandon's, but we also know that because people inside the evangelical movement are also beginning to talk about it in profound ways. Alyssa Childers has the #1 book in Christian apologetics, and she says that deconstruction is a direct attack on the proclamation of the gospel. And I have her book, I've read some of it, and she makes some good points. But I disagree with her. And so in the first week, I focus on the idea that deconstructing faith can. It doesn't always, but it can lead to a maturing faith. And for some of you that have been asking big questions, this is a life-giving message. That instead of backsliding and leaving the faith, that maybe, just maybe, your questions and your doubts are leading you to a more mature faith. In the second week, I shared with you Brian McLaren's 4 stages of faith development. And the big idea there is that to deconstruct to a maturing faith, you got to deconstruct simplicity. that sees the world as us versus them, right versus wrong, good, evil, is very dualistic. You got to move out of simplicity through complexity and perplexity into the fourth stage, which is harmony. And the stage of harmony is the place where you embrace all are one, life is a gift, and love is the point. And we would embrace this because Jesus said, love your enemies, and you can only attempt to love your enemies if you understand that beneath all the conflict and all the things going on in the world, that we are all created by the same God who loves each of us. And Jesus taught to love our enemies because he understood this about all humanity. And Jesus said, blessed are the poor in spirit. That's the person that wakes up each day and they realize today is a gift. I wasn't promised another day. And today is a gift, and I should act out of a sense of gratitude for the gift of life, the opportunity to love. And when Jesus is with his disciples on his last night, he says, a new command I give you, love one another. By this one thing, people will know that you're my disciples if you love as I have loved. Harmony is a place where you embrace all are one, and life is a gift, and love is the point. And if you are here in our church, this is where I'm hoping to help you get to. This is where I'm trying to get to. It's the place where Jesus was. This is what Jesus was all about, but this version of American Christianity, as I studied it and began to preach on it, I discovered that it's really about clear boundaries and divine hierarchies. During the time of slavery, there was a clear boundary between slaves and masters. During the time of segregation, there's a clear boundary between white people and black people. Still today, there's a clear boundary between men and women, and there's a hierarchy where masters, white people, men are on top. And it's all about maintaining these clear boundaries to secure these hierarchies that they say are divine, they are God-given, and they will take a text out of its context to make that case. There you go. Ooh, context. And they would say that this religion, this clear boundaries and divine hierarchies, which they would add an emphasis on end times theology, that any day God could come back in this thing called the rapture, which is not in the Bible, but it's a theological innovation that they bring. And they push this theology and they preach this theology that gets you really afraid, and it's all about the end times. And when you're so terrified about the end times and focus on that, you know what you don't focus on? The injustices, the boundaries, and the hierarchies that oppress people in this time. And they would say that this is old-time religion. We're just preaching the Bible as the Bible says. But this old-time religion is theological innovation. And there's nothing wrong with theological innovation. If you know the history of Christianity, it is peppered with theological innovation all throughout. That's part of our history as Christian people. But to say something is the old-time religion when it actually is an innovation, that's just plain dishonest. And some of you, you haven't been able to put your finger on it, but as you've been exposed to this version of American Christianity, you just feel like something's a bit off, and this would be one of the reasons why. Last week, I felt like, I've been inflicting a lot on the congregation and just me personally. I think we just needed to have a Jesus break. And I had to bring it back because, I love Jesus break dancing, There you go, Gospel of Thomas. And last week, we took a break from just the history and deconstructing this version of American Christianity just to focus in on Jesus and to find the good news that if you are going to reconstruct your faith, and if we as a group of Christians are going to help reconstruct American Christianity, we do it simply on the teachings of Jesus. And I had the cheesiest metaphor last week. I almost brought it back. You remember the metaphor? It was a tool belt. And I even put on the tool belt. And the implication was if you don't have any tools in your tool belt, you can't fix what's broken or build anything that's beneficial. And the teachings of Jesus, these are the tools that he gives us. And you can quote a movie and you can quote a lyric. You might be able to quote your parents. But as a disciple of Jesus, we are to quote the master. And when we're to have a conversation about what to do and how to live, we should be quoting him and talking about, well, Jesus said this and Jesus said that. That's what it means to be his disciples. And we have to learn it. You can't just confess his name. Yes, God saves you out of grace. But if you are to be a disciple and to make an impact on this world, you got to learn it. This is why when Jesus is asked, what is the greatest commandment? He starts off with this one: love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and all your mind. We have to learn the teachings of the Master. That's how we reconstruct our faith, because if you know his teachings, then somebody can't say something that's contrary to what he was about and say, that's done in the name of Christianity. You'll be immune to that because you know the Master. So, you know how we do this? Text and context, you all go, ooh, context. Can I try something new with you today? Thank you, whoever said sure. Yes or no? Yes or no? Yes, okay, all right, this is gonna be terrible. I'm gonna do it first and then you all need to do it, okay? And it has a hand gesture, it's like this, all right? Everybody get your thumbs ready. Statistics, sweet. We probably won't be bringing that back. The Public Religious Research Institute did a survey in 2011, and they asked people whether or not personal immorality is disqualifying for elected officials. And 44% of Americans says personal immorality is not disqualifying for elected officials. Then they segmented the survey, and they found amongst white evangelicals, 30% said that personal immorality is not disqualifying for elected officials. To put it the opposite way, 70% of white evangelicals think that if a politician has an immorality issue, that should disqualify them from elected office. And this isn't shocking that the white evangelicals felt stronger about this issue than the rest of the American population, because for decades, they've been pushing the idea of character being critical for political office. For example, Reverend James Dobson said, character does matter. You can't run a family, let alone a country, without it. And he was referring to Bill Clinton's affair with Monica Lewinsky. Some of you remember that. In 2016, they asked the same question, and 61% of Americans said personal immorality is not disqualifying for elected officials. There was a growth, which is a little shocking and disturbing to me. But even more shocking is the absolute flip for white evangelicals. In 2011, 70% of white evangelicals, church-going people, said personal immorality, if you're messing around at home, if you're doing things that are dishonest, should disqualify you from office. 5 years later, 70% say, hey, it doesn't disqualify you. An absolute flip, dramatic flip. Tim Alberta, in his book, The Kingdom, the Power, and the Glory, he interviews Robert Jeffers, the pastor of First Baptist Church in Dallas, Texas. Jeffers becomes a known national person during Mitt Romney's campaign for elected office, for the presidency. And Jeffers said that Mitt Romney, he was not qualified to run for office because he was a Mormon, and Jeffers has called Mormonism a cult. That's his belief, not mine. And so he attacked Romney, saying, he's not a Christian, we can't trust him. He became a regular commentator on Fox News and a spiritual advisor later for Donald Trump. When asked by Tim Alberta, a journalist, what is going on with this flip? Because the white evangelicals used to be the morality people, and all of a sudden they're the least likely to think personal morality is a key thing for elected office. Why has this group flipped? And Robert Jeffers is a pastor of white evangelicals, and Jeffers offers a two-word response. He says, under siege. The reason that we've absolutely flipped on this issue of personal morality is that we're under siege. In one of his sermons, he says this: we've allowed the secularists, the humanists, the atheists, and the infidels to pervert our Constitution. Constitution, wait, I thought you were a pastor, not a politician. Constitution into something our founding fathers never intended. You see, for Jeffers, a political threat is a divine threat. It's a threat against God. Because Jeffers, he has an Old Testament theology. He wouldn't say that, but I've listened to him and studied him, and this is what I believe. He's got this Old Testament theology that you find all over this version of American Christianity that says if you turn your back on God, God will turn on you. It's a blessing and curses theology that you can find in the Old Testament. It's part of the key storyline of the Old Testament. The people of ancient Israel, they were invited into a covenant with God. You've heard of the 10 commandments. There's 613 total. And God says, if you follow my commandments, I will bless you and protect you. If you don't, I won't. Blessing and curses theology. That is in the Old Testament. But we are people of the new covenant in Jesus Christ. And so Jeffers is using a theology that is not a Jesus-focused theology. We've talked about this many times here in our church. We've done the irresistible study with Andy Stanley's material. This is a key idea. When Jesus came, nothing remained the same. Jesus changed everything and brought us into a new covenant. And this theology, it's in the Bible. It's just the part that Jesus fulfilled and brought us into something new. Now, Jeffers, he was not the first person to preach this kind of idea. It's all over this version of American Christianity. And his predecessor was the famous Reverend W.A. Criswell of First Baptist Church, a very famous pastor. At one point in time, apparently, Billy Graham even said that Dr. Criswell was his personal pastor. And Criswell, in 1956, called forced desegregation a denial of all that we believe in. See, political threats were divine threats, were theological threats. And what had happened is in 1954, Brown versus Board of Education ruled that the white-only schools had to be desegregated. Tim Alberti says that Criswell made frequent appeals during this time to a Genesis passage that purportedly cursed Noah's son Ham and doomed all African Americans to a life of subservience. This was his theology. You can argue that from the Bible, and many people did. And Criswell, during this period, preached openly white supremacy from the pulpit of First Baptist Church in Dallas. And other people preached that as well, and they didn't just preach messages about white supremacy. They also decided to pull their kids out of these newly desegregated schools and create all-white Christian academies, what historians call segregationist academies. And they would pull all their kids out and leave the public schools, and these academies would be tax exempt. Historian says a number of white evangelical communities opened private schools as a way to oppose school desegregation, framing their hostility to Brown and Board as an expression of religious freedom rather than a defense of racial segregation. And this idea of religious freedom, which you've heard, I'm sure, in the news, it's been used throughout American history to oppose the abolition of slavery, women's suffrage, LGBTQ equality, immigration, and the Americans with Disabilities Act. I'm just wondering, what is their problem with people with disabilities? Two schools that are famous for being segregationist academies was Lynchburg Christian School, which is the precursor to Liberty University, and Bob Jones University. In 1964, Dr. Martin Luther King and the other civil rights activists put their lives on the line to get racial equality, and the Civil Rights Act was passed. During that time, Jerry Falwell, who was the founder of Lynchburg Christian School and Liberty University, who by that point in time was a nationally known individual because of his syndicated television program called the Old Time Gospel Hour, he said this about Dr. Martin Luther King and the other civil rights activists: preachers are not called to be politicians, but soul winners. And he would talk about how he had no time left to engage in politics because he was spending all of his time spreading the gospel. Eventually, the Green versus Kennedy case went to the Supreme Court. A group of black Mississippi parents started a court case suing these desegregationist academies for being white-only academies. And the IRS started to challenge the tax exemption of these segregationist academies. They had a criteria that they had to fulfill to keep their schools open to show that they weren't intentionally trying to create segregationist academies. In response to it, Falwell says, in some states it's easier to open a massage parlor than a Christian school. This, coupled with President Johnson's Great Society programs and the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which gave African Americans the right to vote, further altered the terrain of America's legalized racial hierarchy. And as I mentioned in the beginning, I didn't know how this sermon series was going to go. There's a certain sense of trying to follow where the Spirit's leading me when I write my sermon series. And it was imprinted on me that right at the center of the review that I just gave you is this idea of clear boundaries and divine hierarchies. The version of American Christianity that stands in the way of the gospel of Jesus wants to divide us into two groups and have a clear boundary between people so that they can maintain a hierarchy with some people privileged over the others. Bob Jones University refuses to comply to the desegregation. Bob Jones himself preaches white supremacy from the pulpit until his death. And eventually, the IRS under President Richard Nixon revokes the tax-exempt status of Bob Jones University and other segregationist academies. The federal government, white evangelical leaders such as Jerry Falwell and Paul Weyrich argued, was not only invading local autonomy, but was turning its back against whites and favoring African Americans and Latinos. And if you know anything about the ideology of white supremacy, there's this idea called replacement theory that Tucker Carlson was famously criticized over and over again for promoting on his show, where there's an intentional conspiracy to replace white people with people of color, to switch that power balance. Paul Weyrich, who was mentioned in that previous quote, he was not a pastor or a church leader. He's a political operative. And he had been trying for years to get the white evangelical movement and the fundamentalists involved in politics as a political strategy. And so he tried school prayer and pornography and women's rights, which, to be clear, he was opposed to, and abortion, all his issues to try to galvanize the white evangelical vote. But he didn't really care about any of these issues in particular. Rather, as he says in his own words, we are radicals who want to change the existing power structure. And he would succeed. He would succeed in changing the balance of power. Together, Paul Weyrich with Jerry Falwell, they would found the moral majority at the end of the 1970s. And in a speech right around that time, talking about why Jerry Falwell, who criticized Dr. King for being involved in politics, was now getting involved in politics, here's what Falwell has to say. Americans, he insisted, are sick and tired of the way that amoral liberals are trying to corrupt our nation. Young people are reared in a different world. Television is their babysitter, he says. They've learned a loss of respect for human life, disrespect the family as God had established it with men over women. And public schools are permeated with secular humanism, and the government has taught them socialism and welfare. Some very dark clouds are on Americans' horizon because we have turned our backs on God. There's that Old Testament theology. We need to get back to the basics, the fundamentals, biblical morality, patriotism. We need to stand against the ERA, the Equal Rights Amendment, which they successfully kept from ever being ratified. The feminist movement and the homosexual revolution, because we have enjoyed 204 years of unparalleled freedom in America. Which makes me want to ask Jerry the question, 204 years of freedom for who? For black people who didn't receive the right to vote until 1965? For women? For the gay community? 204 years of freedom for who? Now, Falwell was not the only person. The moral majority wasn't the only organization at this time to promote this view of things. James Dobson founded Focus on the Family. Pat Robertson and Ralph Reed, the Christian Coalition. You have Tony Perkins with the Family Research Council. And then Ralph Reed founds Faith and Freedom Coalition, which helped get Donald Trump elected. And the thing that all these various political, religious action groups, what they had in common is that they just over and over again, they would preach this fear. Bad days are on the horizon. Things have gotten so bad. There's a conspiracy. There's these bad guys out to get us. At first, it was the communists during the Cold War. But after the Cold War ended, it became the culture wars. And the fear was turned inside. Here's Pat Robertson on his show, The 700 Club. A caller writes in and says, Pat, last week you were talking about COVID-19. And you quoted Chronicles 7:14. It It's actually 2 Chronicles 7:14. We just looked at it in our Bible study before church. And this is a scene where Solomon, King Solomon of ancient Israel, he's dedicating the temple. And so this is thousands of years ago, and they're under the covenant, the old covenant with God, the blessings and curses covenant. And Solomon knows that things are going to go bad for the people of Israel. He prays in chapter 6 about how that's inevitable. And then he says, God says, if you will turn from your wicked ways and come back here and offer sacrifices and pray here in the temple, then I will forgive you and restore the land. That's the context. This is part of ancient Israel's history under the old covenant. But Pat Robertson, he routinely takes the text out of its context to support his theology of fear. He proof texts. He takes this old covenant text that was about ancient Israel and applies it to America, which is nowhere in the Bible. The caller continues, how can God heal our land and forgive the sins when abortion and same-sex marriage are laws and many people are anti-Israel? Doesn't this prevent his healing and forgiveness? Robertson says, the Bible says, which is one of their phrases, they turn from their wicked ways. Then he heals the land. It's not before. You were right. According to Pat Robertson, COVID-19 is punishment for America turning its back on God. It's just one example of the kind of preaching and theology that these guys push in their culture war. Got a question for you. Which issue do you think has been most effective in pulling together the religious right and creating division within our country? Was it God's design for the family, the socialist government, the feminist revolution, support for Israel? These are all issues that all these guys routinely go back to and preach on. You see it all over. Well, there's one issue that becomes the most powerful unifying issue of them all. And that issue is the issue of abortion. And abortion is so powerful, and you can breathe easy. I'm not going to talk about whether abortion is ethically right or wrong, whether you should be pro-choice or pro-life. Maybe we should do that in some other sermon. We can break that down, but that's not today. I just want to talk about the history of how this became an issue, such a divisive issue in America. Abortion is so effective because you can easily create clear boundaries and divine hierarchies. You're either pro-life or you murder babies. I know that's harsh, but that's how they talk about it. Our own friend Bill here, allowed me to interview him and tell his story. You can watch it on YouTube. And he talks about how he was speaking with one of his friends about this issue. And Bill had changed some of his views and had a more nuanced view about the topic of abortion. And he laid that out for his friend. And his friend at the end said, Bill, I just don't understand why you can't say abortion is murder. It's that clear cut. And for many in America, because the religious right has pushed this issue, and I'm not trying to tell you where to believe. I think that there's good reasons to be on both sides. It's a complex issue that deserves conversation and lots of compassion towards each other. But for the way that the religious right has talked about it, it is very cut and dry. It is obvious. There's a clear hierarchy. You're pro-life or you murder babies, and this is a key issue. But the thing is, this moral clarity is not supported by history. They didn't always believe this. In fact, when Roe versus Wade was passed in 1972, most of them were not anti-abortion. In fact, in 1968, a symposium sponsored by the Christian Medical Society and Christianity Today, the flagship evangelical magazine founded by Billy Graham, refused to characterize abortion as sinful. In 1971, the Convention of the Southern Baptists endorsed a resolution calling for legalization of abortion to preserve the emotional, mental, and physical health of the mother. Even Criswell believed that life started when somebody was born. I've always felt that it was only after a child was born and had a life separate from its mother that it became an individual. I'm not trying to persuade you either way on this issue. I'm just telling you the history. This is Andrew Whitehead. He's a professor of sociology of religion here in Indianapolis. He's written 2 books. A couple of years back, I did a series called Church and State, and I preached from his book, Taking Back America from God. It's a quantitative study of Christian nationalism, meaning surveys and hard data. His second book, American Idolatry, is more of a qualitative study. It's more of his reflection on the history and more of his opinions. And he tells some of his story. Andrew grew up in a white evangelical church in northern Indiana. And he says, I can still remember hearing Randall Balmer, who I was quoting from just a minute ago, with those statistics about the Southern Baptist Convention and whatnot. I can still remember hearing Randall Balmer, distinguished historian, share how it was race, not abortion, divorce, or homosexuality that served as a catalyst for the Christian right. Learning this, Whitehead says, raised questions about the other moral issues that were deal breakers to being a good American Christian. Learning this history of how the issue of abortion was not the catalyst, as the religious right would claim, as Jerry Falwell would later claim, but rather it was when the IRS got involved and started threatening the tax-exempt status of their segregationist academies, that this was the catalyst. Something had always felt off, but the origin of this, for Whitehead, it caused him to begin to deconstruct the whole faith system that he was a part of. And some of you, your deconstruction stories come in a different way, but you came across something that just didn't fit with the teachings of Jesus, didn't fit with the love that you were taught that God has for you and everybody, and it just begins to make you question one thing and then another thing and then the whole thing. And that's Dr. Whitehead's experience. Let me ask you a question. How many of these issues did Jesus focus on in his teachings? I think maybe it's one. It's respect for human life. But he never mentions abortion. Rather, he talks about respect for human life in ways like this. He says, don't worry about your life, what you're going to wear, what you're going to eat. Look at the birds of the air. They neither reap nor sow, and your heavenly Father feeds them. Are you not much more valuable than the birds of the air? You're of extreme value. What Jesus is saying is we should have faith over fear. That we can trust God, that God is a good God that loves us right where we are, and we should not be motivated by fear. His disciples understood how profound this idea is. One of them, John, would later write in one of his letters, there is no fear in love. But perfect love drives out fear. Because fear, it has to do with punishment. Like turn your back on God and God will turn on you sort of punishment. That is at the center of the preaching of people like Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson. The one who fears, John, the disciple of Jesus, says, is not made perfect in love. Why? Because when you believe you're under siege, the fear makes your morality disappear. The fear makes your morality disappear. You're in a reactive state. And your capacity to love somebody, let alone love an enemy, is greatly reduced if you're filled with fear. And Jesus over and over again teaches us not to fear. You can trust God. You can trust God. You can have faith. Don't be motivated by fear. Some more statistics. People are asked, is American culture and the way of life, has it changed for the worse since 1950? 55% of Americans said yes, our culture and way of life has gotten worse since the 1950s. 77% of white evangelicals think it has gotten worse. This group of people who've been taught a theology of fear over and over again think that things have gotten worse. And yeah, there's issues. There's a concentration of wealth that has happened over my lifetime that has eroded the middle class, and there's poverty issues. There's a lot of stuff. But, it's gotten better for African American people. It's gotten better for gay people. It's gotten better for women. You can't smoke on a plane anymore. I mean, there's seat belts, okay? But when you hear over and over again the dark clouds and all this stuff, it gets in you, and the fear, it just grips you. It's hard to break from. Because things have gotten so far off track, we need a leader who is willing to break some rules and to set things right. 38% of Americans believe that, we need a leader who's just going to break the rules. White evangelicals are right on par with that. Most frightening is this. Because things have gotten so far off track, true American patriots may have to resort to violence to save our country. 23% of Americans think that we might have to resort to violence against each other to save our country. 31% of Christians think we have to resort to violence. People who follow Jesus, who prayed for his enemies from the cross, who would refuse to pick up a sword. What version of a Christianity is this? Forsaking our Lord. It makes me furious. This is love, John says. Not that we love God, but that he loved us. He sent his son as an atoning sacrifice for our sins. The Christian message, the good news is our sins are paid for. This is why we don't have to fear. It's good news. No amount of abortion or homosexuality or bad books or whatever the issue is being put up, no amount is going to make God turn his back on us. That's Old Testament. We're part of the new covenant as Jesus followers. And the good news message is that through Christ, God has done something that has changed the world. It has changed the world and it has changed your relationship with God. And we are to be profoundly changed by it. And we don't resort to violence anymore. We don't just let morality go out the window. We try to love each other because we're not filled with fear. And any version of Christianity that gets that wrong, they might claim Jesus, but they're not about Jesus. And here's the good news. I truly believe this is good news. I think what Jesus is offering is what people are looking for. All those folk that are leaving the church, all those projections of the decline of the church, I don't think that's bad if they're leaving this version that ends up in saying it's okay to take violence. That's great. Leave that, please. Let's accelerate that. Leave that version of faith that claims Jesus but forsakes him at his core. What Jesus really offers, what he really offers, I think everyone is looking for. So what do? We do what he tells us to do. We witness to the good news of Jesus Christ. That's what he calls us to do, not take over political office. You can be a Christian and be in politics, that's fine, but the goal is not to take over the government or what have you. We witness, we share about faith in the face of fear. We choose faith over fear. I trust you, God. I'm going to do what I can do and trust you to do what only you can do, God. And that takes real courage. I'm going to have faith over fear. I'm going to have hope over despair. I don't believe that the world is getting worse and worse and worse and is all inevitable. I certainly don't believe in premillennial dispensationalism and the 7-year tribulation, which is made up. There's no 7 years attached to the tribulation. They just tied all that together and then they say it's a simple reading. It's nonsense. I don't believe that. I believe in hope because of who God is revealed to me in Jesus. I believe that the point is to love, not spread hate and division, to have compassionate conversations about complex issues. Let us pray.